Hi, welcome back. My bookshelf is a disaster right now. I'm also a little bit out of breath, and I'm finally going to be filming a video that I've been putting off since the beginning of the year. If you watched my 2022 goals video, you'll know that one of my goals for 2022 is to get started on a project where I am going to be attempting to figure out what my favorite books are. The way I'm going to do that, obviously, is I'm going to be rereading some of my favorite books of years past. I went back and I watched every single one of my previous favorites videos from every year that I've been on BookTube, and I kind of compiled a list of the books that I think are like the true contenders for books that have stuck with me, books that I truly think could become all-time favorite books. And today I'm going to share that list with you. This is basically just every book that I considered a favorite at one point or another in whatever year I read it. And also I have a few selections from before I started doing BookTube. These are books that I am going to be attempting to reread over, I want to say this year, but I know that I'm not going to be able to reread every single one of these books in the next few months. So I'm going to be probably extending this out through a couple of years. I have 36 books to talk about today, and I just know that there's no way that I'm going to be able to reread 36 books this year. So I'm going to be sprinkling in some rereads throughout the year. I've actually already reread a couple of the books that I'm going to show you. I don't have a specific selection that I'm going to try to reread this year. I'm just going to be picking and choosing from these. And there honestly probably are a few other books that weren't necessarily favorites of the year that I read them that have stuck with me that I could potentially reread this year as well. I don't really know. I'm just gonna kind of see as the year goes on. But these are the books, these 36 books are the books that I think are kind of like the most likely candidates for books that I could consider my all-time favorite books. I don't know what my end goal for this project is, except for that I would like to kind of have a better idea of my reading tastes, which if I'm looking at the books all spread out in front of me, I can kind of see what genres I tend to go for and what I tend to love the most, which is very illuminating. But I just would like to have kind of like a solid list of things that are in the realm of favorites, because there's just no way that all of these books are like all-time favorite books, you know? I'm going to show you the 36 books that I have here, and I'm going to try to do it fast because obviously this is a lot of books to talk about, and I'm not going to be going into a lot of detail about all of these books considering that I've reviewed them in some form or fashion on my channel in the past. I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to go by year. At first I was just going to do it willy-nilly, and then I just kind of got overwhelmed by the prospect of doing that. So I separated them by year that they were in my favorites videos or whatever. So I'm going to obviously start with the pre-booktube books. I have 4 books that I think are true contenders for favorite book that I read before I started booktube. So the first one is the book that for the very longest time, like literally up until about 2016, 2017, this was the book that I considered to be my all-time favorite book, and that is The Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger. I've read this a couple of times, but it's been probably at least 5 years, if not more, since I read this. So I'm interested to see how I feel about it now. I feel like I'm going to have some different opinions about it. I feel like that's gonna happen. So this is the first book. Also, I've got One Day by David Nichols. I really like this book, but I kind of suspect that the reason that I like it so much is the circumstance in which I read it. It involves a high school relationship and a road trip, and I'm gonna leave it at that. I kind of think that that might be why this one holds such a special place in my heart, because I don't really remember any particulars about it except for the ending. So I'll be interested to see how I feel about it on a reread. Next up is Life of Pi by Ian Martell. I think I read this in like 10th or 11th grade, and I do remember sitting in chemistry class and I wasn't paying attention. I was just reading, and he was like, oh, I guess this class is too boring for you. I guess you just need to read. And that's a specific memory that I have associated with this book. But again, it's been so long, I don't really remember any of the particulars except for the ending. So I'll be interested to see how I feel about this one. And my last pre-booktube book is, of course, The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. I feel like for such a long time, this was kind of like just a, in general, bookish darling. I have only read it one time, so I will be very interested to see how I feel about it on a reread. I do really have such fondness for the story, and I did really enjoy the movie as well, but I'm not sure if it's going to stick with me or if it's gonna like hold up in my eyes as much as it did when I initially read it. So again, super intrigued to see how I feel about this one on a reread. Moving on to 2013, I'm not gonna list every single book that I considered favorites that year, because I just know that there are books on all of my lists that are not really in contention. They're books that I loved in the moment for whatever reason, but not books that have stuck with me, or not books that I would consider favorites, or they may be books that I've read and don't want to taint the memory of reading them with a reread, or they may be books that I just know for a fact that they're not going to have the same level of love. So I have 3 books from 2013. This was the first year I was on BookTube, and I wasn't on BookTube very long. I think I started in like May or June, so I was only really on BookTube for the last half of the year. The first one, I know I owned this book at one point, and I guess I unhauled it. I cannot remember unhauling it, but that's Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. This is the first Murakami I ever read, and also at this point it's the only one I've read, but it did really strike me when I initially read it. And a lot of people say that your first Murakami is always destined to be your favorite. I'm not sure if I'm really interested in his books now to the point where I want to read more, but I definitely do want to give Norwegian Wood a reread at some point, so I'm gonna do that. The other 2 2013 books are both YA. I've got Jellicoe Road by Melina Marchetta, which I feel like I've talked about so much on my channel because it holds such a special place in my heart, and I've reread it many times. So I don't even know if I'm going to reread this one this year because I actually just reread it, I think in 2019 or 2020. It's not been that long since I reread it, but I do really love this, and I do think this one is definitely a contender for one of my all-time favorite books because I really love this story, and I can't explain why, but I just really absolutely love it. And then also I have How I Live Now by Meg Rosoff, which I think when I put this on my favorites of 2013 list, it was a reread that year. So I think I've read this a couple of times. I am very interested to see how I feel about this one because this one has some controversial subject matter and definitely not something that I think would be beloved now. I just really enjoyed it when I read it. It also won the Prince Award, which I think is interesting. And the movie with Saoirse Ronan is a really great adaptation, so I will definitely be interested to see how I feel about this one. I kind of feel like I might still enjoy it, but I don't know, we'll see. Moving on to 2014, I only have 2 books from 2014. First is I Am the Messenger by Marcus Zusak. I think that this one probably won't hold up, to be honest. It stuck out to me so much because I did really love The Book Thief, and it hadn't been that long since I read that one originally, so I'm not sure if this one will hold up, but I do really like Marcus Zusak's writing style, so I'll be interested to see how I feel. This one's more of a mystery, whereas The Book Thief is historical fiction, so very different genres. And then speaking of historical fiction, I also have Codename Verity by Elizabeth Wein, another one that I actually just reread, I think in 2019 or 2020, and know without a shadow of a doubt that it's going to end up on my favorites of all time list because I absolutely love this book. I've read it 3 or 4 times. Like, I probably won't reread it this year, but I absolutely love it. And I know that it's probably going to be in my like top 10 of all time. Next up, I think we're up to 2015. And 2015 was the year that I really started reading super hyped, popular books on BookTube. This was the year that a lot of people, like, or at least I was noticing that people's favorites were repetitive, which I guess is still the case. But I feel like 2015 was the year that everybody started kind of reading the same things. There were books that were popular with like publishing, and that may have been when like publishers started sending books and ARC started being like more widely available on BookTube. But I just know that 2015 was the year that I really got sucked into a lot of hype surrounding books when it came to BookTube. The 4 books that I have selected from 2015 I know were like very beloved during that time. First is the book that I considered my favorite of 2015, and that's The Opposite of Loneliness by Marina Keegan. Now, I think that I liked this one so much because it's such a sad story. You know, she wrote this collection, and it was published posthumously because she passed away just a few days after her graduation from college. And so it kind of became a bit of a sensational book. Like, a ton of people were reading and loving it. It's a collection of essays and short stories, which I know for a fact now I wouldn't love this as much if I read it for the first time because I don't love short story collections. I don't love essay collections. There's going to be something in here that I'm not going to enjoy. I know that. But I think because I was a similar age as the author and I was getting ready to graduate college myself when I read this, that I just kind of got sucked into the sensationalized version of this book. So I'm going to be super interested to reread it and see how I feel about it now as someone who's pretty far removed from college and from kind of that feeling. Also in 2015 was when I read Station 11 for the first time. I actually have already reread this one. I reread it in January. You can check out my thoughts in my January wrap-up. Didn't love it as much on a reread as I thought I would. And I don't know if it's because I've read it so many times or because I just basically have been living through a pandemic for the past couple of years, but it didn't strike me as much as I thought it would. I still love it. Absolute masterpiece of a book. It's totally amazing and something that I do think will probably end up in my favorite books list, if not the #1 spot. But I don't know. It was a weird reading experience reading it this time around. All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. This one was another one that I feel like was everywhere on BookTube in 2015 and was on so many people's favorites of the year list. I'm so interested to see how I feel about it now. Historical fiction, something I really love, but have not been reading a ton of in the last couple of years, to be honest. I think it's gonna hold up. Honestly, I think it will, but I'll be interested to see if it does. I can't believe all these books were 2015. I feel like I read them so much more recently than 7 years ago. And lastly, for 2015, I've got The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry, another one that I feel like was pretty popular on BookTube. This one, I think it's just like kind of a charming little story. I really don't know if this one will hold up, if I will love it as much another time around, but I do really love the idea of a grumpy man, bookshop owner, taking in a child. It's just, there's just some qualities, you know, so I am excited to reread this one. Next up is 2016, and I think this is the year that I have the most that I'm rereading from, because 2016 I think was probably one of the best reading years of my life. And obviously my channel, I have 6 books from 2016 that I am going to attempt to reread this year. First up, I've got The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, another like just BookTube favorite. Feel like when this one came out, or when it started getting popular on BookTube, it kind of just like spread very quickly, and I fell into the hype and I read it and I really enjoyed it, so I'm very excited to reread it. Another one that just absolutely took over BookTube was Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. Actually, I think I'm going to try to reread this one soon, because I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and I just kind of keep looking at it on my bookshelf, and I'm like, I really am ready to reread that. This one was another one, like I said, that just, it was all over BookTube. It was just such a favorite. I feel like so many people that year had this one on their favorites list, and for absolute good reason. Nonfiction, haven't had a ton of that. Actually, don't think I've had any, or well, I guess the opposite of loneliness, but nonfiction, I've got 84 Charing Cross Road by Helene Hempf. This is just a nice little collection of letters between a bookseller and a writer during World War II, and I just remember feeling so like warmed by this book. I feel like it's just like a charming little story of friendship, and I'm really excited to go back into that one. Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I'm not really nervous about this one, but I feel like I've seen the movie a couple of times, and I've seen the movie a couple times since I read this, and I'm not sure if like my feelings about the movie are going to taint the reading experience. I know Sabrina over at Bookish Sabrina just recently reread this, and for her it did not hold up, and so I'm a little bit interested to see how I feel about it, but I'm excited to get into it again nonetheless. Also, I've got The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which I feel like is such a beloved book by so many people on the internet and off. It's the only Donna Tartt I've ever read, and I'm just excited to see how I feel about it on another go. I think I'm going to enjoy it just as much, if not more. And the last one from 2016 was the book that was my favorite in 2016, and I went on and on about it, and that's The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. Another one that is historical fiction, sweeping tale. I am a little bit nervous about rereading this one, because since I read it, some other people have read it and think that it is a bit problematic and a little boring, and so I will be very interested to see how I feel about it. I listened to the audiobook the first time, so I might reread it physically the second time around. Next up is 2017, and I also had a pretty good reading year in 2017. Probably the book that is the least likely to end up on my all-time favorites, but one that I'm so intrigued to reread is Swimming Lessons by Claire Fuller. This is a book that I feel like I've never heard anybody on BookTube talk about, but I absolutely loved it when I read it the first time. I'm so intrigued to read it again, because this is one that I feel like I think about a lot. Like, I feel like this one just pops into my head randomly a lot more often than a lot of these other books, so I'm very intrigued to see how I feel about it on a reread. Also, I've got The Enchanted by Renee Denfeld. I've been wanting to reread this book probably since like I finished it the first time around. This is just like one of the most beautifully written books I've ever read, and I feel like this was another one that kind of like took over BookTube. I've read some other books by this author since then, and I've enjoyed them less, so I am excited to see if this one kind of holds up for me. I'm also excited to see if The Unseen World by Liz Moore holds up, because this is another one that just was like all over BookTube, such a BookTube darling. I really enjoyed it. I fell into the hype and I really liked it, but I do remember thinking at the end of the year when I was like reflecting on my favorite books that this one didn't stick with me throughout the year as much as I wanted it to. Funnily enough, it has stuck with me past that, and I remember thinking that for like my favorites video. I think I even said it in my favorites video that it didn't stick with me, but I think about this book all the time, so it may not have like stuck with me in the short term, but in the long term I really have loved it, so I'm excited to reread it. And then finally from 2017, I've got Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery, another one that just is like one of the most like heartwarming, cheerful little books. I love Anne. She's such a precocious little main character, and I am so in love with this story in general. Even before I read the book, I was super familiar with Anne of Green Gables because I really love the Canadian miniseries that was on in like the 80s and 90s. So I'm excited to reread it and see if I love it just as much. I've never continued on and read more in the series, but I definitely want to try to do that. So I'm excited to reread Anne at some point. Next is 2019, and 2019 was also a pretty good reading year for me because I also have 6 books from 2019 to reread this year. 2019 was the year that I discovered and fell in love with Taylor Jenkins Reid, the year that I started getting really into nonfiction and adult fantasy. So I've got a ton of stuff here that I'm excited to revisit, starting with 2 Taylor Jenkins Reid books. I'm gonna reread One True Loves at some point. For a long time, I considered this one my favorite Taylor Jenkins Reid book, and then I read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and this one I think is probably my favorite. Maybe Daisy Jones. I haven't decided, but I'm gonna reread both of these at some point, probably this year, because I think I'm gonna do some kind of video where I talk about all of her books. Hopefully they'll hold up for me. I think of the 2, the one that's least likely to hold up is probably One True Loves, because I have seen some like more problematic takes on it since I read it originally, but I'm still excited. Also, I've got Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is just one of like my favorite nonfiction books that I've ever read, and I finally bought a copy of it last year. I listened to the audiobook the first time, and I think this time around I'm gonna read it physically and then like kind of mark up and tab some of my favorite parts, because there are bits of this book that really have still stuck with me since I read it. I think if this was the book that I considered my favorite in 2019, I honestly can't remember, but that's Neverworld Wake by Marisha Pessl. This is kind of like a speculative contemporary story, and as we know, I'm not so into YA lately, but I will be interested to see how I feel about this one on a reread, because this is another one that I feel like I think about a lot. And then, like I said, 2019 was the year that I started really getting into adult fantasy, so I've got The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, the first book in the Mistborn trilogy. I have never continued on with this trilogy, and a big part of that is because I've been wanting to reread this one for a while. So I'm going to try to do that maybe in March. I might try to reread it in March and then continue on with the series. My brother actually just recently finished reading the entire Mistborn series, including the continuation, and he absolutely loves them, which is a huge motivating factor for me to want to revisit the story and like finish off the trilogy. And then the one I'm currently rereading is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. Probably will be done with this one by the time this video goes up. Again, kind of like Mistborn, I'm ready to continue on with the series, and so I'm going to be rereading this one. But I also do think that this one could potentially be an all-time favorite, so I'm excited to reread that one, or to continue rereading it as I'm doing that right now. I think I'm off. I think that was 2018 that I just did, and these are 2019. Yeah, those are definitely 2018. This is definitely 2019. So first up, the other one that I don't own, but I definitely want to buy a copy of it, is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. Another work of nonfiction. This is one that I don't know if I'll reread, to be honest. This is something that I definitely would consider to be like an all-time favorite. It's just like one of the most well-written, heartbreaking memoirs that I've ever read. And I don't know if like emotionally I could handle rereading it. I will probably do it at some point. It's just amazing. And I definitely wanted to include it on this list because I do think it could be a contender for favorite book. While I'm at it, I'll just get the other nonfiction book out of the way, Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. Another memoir that is just, it's so fantastic. In 2019, this was my favorite book of the year, and it's still a book that I think about all the time. I don't know, I definitely want to revisit it at some point. It's a book that I literally think about it all the time. I think about the story, and I think about the struggles that Jon Krakauer faced while writing this book and post-publishing it and everything. And I love it so much. I think there's just so much complexity to this, and it's part of a much wider conversation. So this is one that I definitely want to try to reread. It's one that I absolutely know will hold up and will probably end up being in my favorites. And then I also have Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which I have actually already reread. I reread this one in January as well. So you can watch my January wrap up to get my thoughts. After rereading it, I did kind of feel like this one maybe moving above Evelyn Hugo in terms of like my favorite Taylor Jenkins read, but I'll have to reread Evelyn Hugo to determine that for sure. But I really enjoyed this. It was a great reread, and I love this book. And then I have 2 YA books here to finish off 2019, and that is A Heart and a Body in the World by Deb Coletti. Another one of the most like heartbreaking stories that I've ever read, and if any YA book could be in my favorites, it's probably this one, as well as Dig by A.S. King, my favorite A.S. King book. I've had such a love-hate relationship with her books, but this one was just truly amazing. I've got some sticky notes in there, tabbing up some of my favorite bits. This is just one of the most, like, the strangest but most like lovely books I've ever read, and I am excited to reread it at some point. And then for 2020, I only have one book on my 2020 from my 2020 favorites that I think could be a true contender, and that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I don't even remember all the books that I considered favorites in 2020. This was definitely not the book that I considered to be my favorite, but this is the one that I think probably has the most potential to be on my favorites list. This is the one that I think about the most often. I also just really want to revisit this story and see if it is the emotional gut punch the second time around. And finally, for 2021, I didn't post a favorites of 2021 video, but there is one book from 2021 that I think could potentially be on my all-time favorite books list, and that's Normal People by Sally Rooney. I just love this. I connected with it. I identified with it. I've talked about it so much, but it's just an amazing book, and I think that of all the books that I've read in the recent few years, this one probably is my favorite. So those are the 36 books that I'm going to be attempting to reread over the course of the next year and a half or so. Like I said, probably won't get to all of them, definitely won't get to all of them this year, but I'm still excited to be revisiting some of my favorite stories from years past. It's going to be an ambitious project, and I will for sure check in probably at the end of the year. Maybe I'll just kind of recap and see where we're at. I made a handy little spread in my bullet journal, which I really don't use that much, but I'm going to be using for tracking my reread, so you can see I've already reread 2. I would really love to know your thoughts, opinions, feelings about any of the books that I mentioned in this video. Are any of these books that you consider to be favorites, or are any of these books that you at one point considered to be favorites and now don't think they hold up? Also, let me know what some of your favorite books are, or what are some books that you would love to revisit at some point and see if they hold up for you. I'd really love to know that as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this probably pretty long video, and I will see you again very soon. Bye!